Hello there. Today I'd like to taste with you a bottle of a wine from the Côte de Bourg. This is Roc des Combes, the 2018 vintage of this. It seems the land where this estate is has been producing wine since the 14th century. The estate's buildings were built in the 1700s, but it wasn't until 1988, possibly late 1987, that somebody called Francois Mitzgerville bought the estate, and he renamed it Roc des Combes. I haven't even found a record of what it had been called beforehand. And Mitzgerville is the owner of one of the leading Saint-Emilion chateaus, Le Tetra Rotebeef, a very well positioned estate on the Côte in Saint-Emilion. He realised that the terroir here was actually very similar to that of his Saint-Emilion property. There were lovely deep clay and limestone soils. There was a south-facing slope with vines on. And where the Côte de Bourg is, you're pretty much opposite Margaux across the Gironde estuary. So you get a lovely tempering influence of the cool from the body of water that is the estuary. And yet at the same time, the south-facing slopes, which actually Roc des Combes vineyards are a hillside called Les Croutes, where the vines run down to the Gironde. So you get fabulous exposure to sunshine and to heat, but actually, again, as I say, that heat is tempered by the fact that you have the cooling influence from the estuary. When Mitzgerville bought the estate, it was in quite a state of disrepair. There was quite a lot of planting went on in the vineyard. The chateau, I believe, needed modernisation, and the cellars possibly hadn't been renovated substantially since the 1700s. He quickly set about to remedy this and very rapidly built up a reputation as the leading estate on the Côte de Bourg, and I think that's highly justified. The estate is actually in the commune of Saint-Laurent-de-Combes. It's about 14 hectares in size, and on average the vines are somewhere in the region of 50 years old, so there's some good old planting material that gives lovely concentrated fruit here. The vineyards are now about 80% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Sauvignon. Previously there'd been Malbec and Cabernet Franc planted as well, but part of the reorganisation of the vineyard has been to remove those. And they only make one wine here, there's no second wine. They do produce another wine from vineyards outside the Côte de Bourg, so that's simply labelled as a Bordeaux, but there is only one wine made from the vineyards here. So my understanding is that the blend of the 2018 is pretty much in line with that of the vineyards. I suppose that's going to be the case if you're not making a second wine, unless you're actually rejecting and selling off wines. You're going to end up with about the same blend for the wine as the constitution of the vineyards. So 80% Merlot, 20% Cabernet Sauvignon. The fruit's hand-picked, and Francois Mitzgerville is well known for allowing the fruit to gain quite high ripeness. I mean, he will pick early or late depending on what he thinks of the flavours that are developed, but generally with his estates these tend to be at higher ripeness levels. Picking is done by hand. Fermentation takes place in traditional cement tanks, but with temperature control. The wine goes into barrel. The oak that's used is high quality French oak in barriques, in 225 litre barriques, so small, relatively small barrels. And of this oak, about 50% is new, so that it's quite a high proportion for a wine from what one would think of as quite a lowly appellation normally. The wine is aged for quite a while for a wine from the Côte de Bourg. It'll stay in barrel for something like 18 to 24 months. So I'm expecting a relatively obvious note of oak in the wine. I've also seen a note that suggests that this wine is actually 15.6% alcohol, although I would say that the label only says 14.5, but it's not unknown that sometimes labels are slightly inaccurate in that way. So let's have a look at the wine and see what we think, shall we? Looking at it to begin with, you've got a pretty good depth of dark ruby red colour, maybe a tiny touch of purple at the rim. I can just see through it, it's not quite opaque, but very nearly. Swirling it, the wine seems to cling to the glass. Certainly it's very reticent to form tears, but is doing so very slowly, and they're quite sort of noticeable there. So maybe it does have that high alcohol. Well, we'll have to see what we think of the flavours. So the aromas, what about those? There's a lovely richness, a ripeness and an opulence to those aromas. Those are dark black cherry, dark plum, ripe notes. There are exotic spices there coming from oak. Cinnamon, particularly cedary notes. Sweet vanilla. There's a rich licoriceiness as well. There's plenty going on in there, and it's a nice intensity there. So let's taste. Gosh, that's a big mouth-filling wine. It's well structured. There's lovely freshness. So you've got this initial rush of black cherries, maybe moving on to very ripe, quite jammy black plum, and you're going through the ripeness spectrum beyond that. There's a licoricey concentration to the mid palate, which I think is amplified by some slightly drying, grainy tannins. But then you move on to more savoury notes. There's a sort of a touch of black olive in there as well. But there's a lovely intensity to the fruit. The wine is pretty full-bodied. I'd certainly think that it was somewhere in the region of 15% alcohol at least. It feels rich and warm and so ripe, almost sort of raisiny tones there. Certainly it seems that the fruit's been picked at high ripeness. The tannins are really very fine, they're grainy, and you can tell there's some really high quality oak has gone into this. You've got that lovely sweet spice note coming through on the mid palate just before the finish there, giving those cinnamon notes, cedar, touches of sweet vanilla. And that all seems to be lifted actually by the alcohol, and it's giving you a sort of, just before the finish, there are notes of ripe licorice, cinnamon sticks. There's almost a mulled wine sort of note in there, slight overripe notes, some quite high-toned, slightly maybe overripe volatile notes. But it's really opulent. And yet somehow the good acidity, although it's full-bodied, there's opulent fruit, the acidity is giving it a freshness that perhaps you wouldn't get from a rich, ripe New World wine in quite the same way. There's something about that freshness and the tannic structure coming from the oak that really frame this wine beautifully. It's very well balanced, it's very intense, it's quite approachable now. I mean, it's got plentiful tannin, but those tannins aren't shown astringently, and this is 2018, so it's still quite a young wine. I would think this has at least 10 years aging potential ahead of it, probably more. Such is the intensity and the ripeness. It is attractive even now, so although I would probably leave it for 2 or 3 years before branching it, I don't think it's likely to live as long as 10 years in my cellar. I'll say that for now. Certainly for a wine from Côte de Bourg, this is not a cheap wine. However, if you compare it to the prices of Le Tetra Rotebeuf, I think actually you're seeing a wine that's offering some fantastic quality at a much more accessible price. So if you want to treat yourself at a reasonable budget, this might be a wine worth thinking about. So I hope you found this tasting interesting. If you have, do please press the like button. That would be fantastic. Do consider sharing it with your friends. Do think about signing up and following us on YouTube. That would be fantastic to have your support there. Any comments you have, please leave those in the comments box below. We would love to get your feedback about the tastings we're doing, the wines that we look at, or anything else related to that. But most importantly, I do hope you'll take some time to join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.